Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, episode 22. I'm Johnny.
And I'm Phil.
And we're doing a bit of a special episode today where we will be talking about a brand new mission that you can try out if you're getting a little bit bored of the same old rulebook missions that you've been playing since you started Bold Action. If you haven't seen already, we have released a brand new t-shirt design on tabletoptommies.com, so please do check that out. It's quite appropriately a British Firefly.
And as previously announced, we also are now on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/tabletoptommies, check out the different tiers, and in return for your monthly support for us, you can get a fantastic range of quality merchandise, new and exclusive to our Patreon listeners. So, Johnny, what's the mission called and where did it come from?
So the mission is called Operation Striking Cobra. So this mission came from Mike Smith of podcast fame, as in from being mentioned on podcasts so often. So Mike Smith told me about a homebrew game he had played, which was inspired by one of the theatre book missions. He couldn't remember which one. It was he thought it was one of the Bulger Overload or one of those. And it sounded like a really fun mission. We then played it to see how it played. And then I wrote it up into a more formal pack so that we could use it for tournaments or just down the club. You could send it to people beforehand so you're not having to explain it at the table, and just to sort of make sure that it is balanced. So what the mission is representing, the original theatre mission, the scenario we're looking at here is the defender is basically, they've captured a town, they've got their troops all garrisoned there, and the attacker has been tasked with capturing back this town. And so that's why the objectives in this one will all start as controlled by the defender. The objectives work slightly differently in this one, as we'll talk about as we're going through it. But in essence, the defender owns all of the objectives at the beginning of the mission because it's their town. They're currently in control of that territory.
Quite similar to, I'm just looking at the Bulge book, to the Battle of Foy, which is the Band of Brothers mission. It's quite similar to that.
It may well be that exact mission that inspired Mike originally. I'll have to show him that one and ask him. So the thing that I liked about the mission, and the reason that when Mike told me about it, I wanted to write it up, was because it's a little bit unique in that it's an objectives mission. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the homebrew missions, the objectives just end up with a fight in the middle. Mm-hmm. I don't know, is that what you found with a lot of the custom missions, Phil?
Yeah, they can do either along the halfway point, 24 inches up from either table edge, or maybe on a diagonal or what have you. But they tend to be pretty much clustered around the middle, or you're basically playing a derivative of key positions, maybe in different quarters or sectors.
Yeah, exactly. So what tends to happen is you tend to have like one on your side, one on their side, one in the middle, and then it just becomes a fight over the middle. Mm-hmm. So what I quite liked is this one is an objectives mission, but you don't have to bring the fight to the very centre of the table.
Okay.
And along with that, one of the other aims was to keep it balanced, because as I said, we may want to use this for tournament play just to give people something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And additionally, it's an attacker-defender mission. So it's one that if you take it to a tournament, it allows you to play attacker-defender, because normally we don't see them at tournaments, do we?
True. Yeah, it tends to be just, you go at it one way or the other rather than having that designated attacker defender.
Yeah, exactly. And there are armies as well that have national characteristics that are beneficial in attacker defender missions, aren't there?
Yeah, it tends to be if you are the defender, you may gain some sort of buff or some kind of positive, yeah.
Yeah, like if you're Italians, you get to be the defender and you get your obstacles. Mm-hmm. Win-win.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you don't have an attacker-defender mission in the pack for your tournament, then any armies like the Italians never get to use that perk. So the aim here was to create one that's as balanced as possible and retain that attacker-defender element. So that's the aim. The aim was to create something a little bit unique, but keep it as balanced as possible. And on that note of being unique, the capturing system in this one is a little bit different, which gives players just a little bit extra to think about. And it also, the reason I like it, is it creates a very dynamic game. So whereas sort of in key positions, you sort of sit on an objective, in this one, you don't have to be sat on the objective to claim it.
Okay.
And so your units can and should probably keep moving around the board and taking more ground, which in key positions, what you tend to find is just the vet squad gets something objective and then just sets up camp, don't they?
Yeah, or you wait for that last turn, or last but one turn dash to contest or maybe push off the enemy, to try and contest or control like an extra objective.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I say, it's a little bit unique. In this one, as I said, it's attacker defender. Once you've chosen who's attacking defender by rolling off, you set up those objectives, which is obviously an easier thing to do in a visual medium to show you where the objectives are placed. If you are listening along, we are releasing this as a PDF on tabletoptommies.com in our blog section. It'll be our latest blog post. So if you want to follow along as we're talking through it, you can go download the PDF. So now that you've had a chance to open that PDF, or for those of you who are potentially driving or doing something where you can't use your eyes to
Yeah,
look at the
don't
PDF,
open the PDF while driving, please.
Phil, do you want to quickly talk through where the objectives should be placed once you've chosen who is the defender?
Cheers, Johnny. So there are 7 objectives in this mission, and they appear in 3 lines. One appears in the defender setup zone, the next line is along the middle, and then the final line is 12 inches from the attacker's edge. You have 2 in the defender zone, and they are 18 inches in from either side of the table edge. So the defender's setup zone is 12 inches from their table edge, and the objectives have to be 6 inches in from their table edge. So the objectives sit in the middle of the defender's setup zone and 6 inches from the defender's table edge. You then have 3 along the center line. 1 is in the middle. The other 2 are 12 inches from either edge. And then the final set, which is towards the attacker's line, they're 12 inches from the attacker's line, and they are 24 inches from either side. So effectively what you have is a 2-3-2 formation.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what sport that's for.
No, I'm just thinking of what sports have 7 people on the
Netball, maybe? I don't know. Lacrosse? Who knows? Pass.
So the key point with this mission is that the objectives are automatically controlled by the defender at the start of the game. And the way you win this game is to have control at the end of the game of more objectives than your opponent. So the emphasis here is on the attacker pushing forward and taking control of an objective during the course of the game. Meanwhile, the defender has to stop the attacker taking control of 4 or more objectives, because as soon as there's only 7, so as soon as the attacker's got 4 objectives, they are going to win the game at the end of it.
Exactly, yeah. And so with this one, the capturing is a little bit different. If you're playing this one, what you want to have is either a 50mm disc with a different colour on each side. That's probably the most effective way to play it. Or you just put a different colour dice on top of the objective to show who's controlling it. Because effectively, the way you control an objective is your infantry or artillery unit touches the objective at the end of the turn, and so long as there are no contesting units from your opposing player touching the objective at the same time, that objective is flipped to your colour. So let's say the defender is red, all the objectives start red. Every time an attacker ends a turn touching the objective without a defender's unit on it, it'll be flipped to, let's say, blue. And so that really nicely just visually shows who is in control of the objectives. Once you've got it, it stays that colour until it changes again.
Fantastic. Now, just to stop the attacker doing things like forward deploying onto objectives or outflanking onto objectives, there are some limitations as well as to setup. The defender has to declare how many of their units, if any, are being left in reserve. That can be up to half of the units rounding down. The remaining units are then deployed on the table in their 12-inch zone. The attacker then selects which of their units will form their first wave and which, if any, are being left in reserve, which can also be up to half of their units rounding down. The attacker does not set up any units on the table. You may not outflank, so that's preventing you from snatching those objectives on the halfway line or in the defender zone later on in the game. Nor are you allowed to forward deploy as the attacker. So you can't forward deploy onto an objective from the start of the game. The defender, however, can forward deploy. And the final couple of things to be aware of is that there is a prep bombardment. Obviously, you've got to roll for it in the normal way. And with regards to bringing on your forces, the defender may attempt to bring on their reserves from turn 1, which is different to normal because normally you'd expect the reserves to come on from turn 2. However, they can bring them on turn 1, but they're going to have to roll for them because they're reserves rather than first wave. The attacker's reserves then can only arrive from turn 2 as per normal.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you've got here is you've got a situation where the defender has the benefit of having the objectives closer to them because their objectives are only 6 inches from their table edge and the attacker's closest objectives are 12 from theirs. And so the defender has the benefit of having those objectives closer, but the attacker has the benefit of getting that first wave on and coming up against an army that's been prep bombarded.
Yep.
Now, because quite often when you have these attacker-defender missions where the defender gets prep bombardment against them, you end up in a position where the attacker really has a lot of momentum because there's nothing the defender can do turn one because everything's got sort of 1 or 2 pins on it, and they fail sort of a test with half their army. And so by allowing the reserves in turn one, it allows the defender to be a little bit snappier in their retaliation, but it's not a guaranteed response because there is always the chance that that Sherman you've held in reserve to see where it needs to be fails its test. And so it's always a bit of a gamble putting stuff in reserve, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the thinking of the special rules there. Again, because outflanking isn't in play, and as the attacker, you're trying to get 4 of these 7. What it means is you can't do that late game snatch you do with key positions. Because you can't just whiz in and take the defender's objective, which we often see when it's a 3 objective key positions, don't we?
Yeah, if you can get the cheeky outflank going, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I really like about this, which I think was part of the design, and I completely forgot about it until just now, is it's deliberately an odd number of objectives such that you can't have a draw.
Yes.
That's actually a feature, not a bug. Because there are missions like Demolition, for example, where if you put that in a tournament pack, basically at the end of the round, most players have just stayed in the same position they were before the game because most players end up with a draw.
Yeah. What I like as well about this with the placement of the objectives is because they are spread wide along the centre line, you've got to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to lean one way to try and get your 4 objectives, lean the other way to try and get your 4 objectives, or if you're going to try and grab all 5, so the 3 along the centre line and the 2 that are closest to the attacker's starting line. However, in doing that, you are going to have to spread, or at some point you might have to rush towards one side and then bring it back once you've claimed that objective and reinforce another area of the board to try and secure, your 4th, 5th objective, for example. But in doing so, you're then risking the defender rushing up from where they are and taking back one of those objectives that you've left on its own.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why the objectives are a little bit, why they're disjointed, why they're not all in a perfect line, because it's giving you sort of an extra thing to think about, because if you're the attacker, those objectives are quite close to the centre, so you're going to sort of drive up the centre to start with. And then you've got a choice, because you've got to go all the way to 12 inches from the table side if you want the middle one on each flank. And so the way I play it is either I try to take control of one whole table side and play for those 5 with the 3 in the middle, or I'll go for sort of the diamond formation and take the 3 down one side and the centre one. But the really nice thing is if you're the attacker, is if you are going for that diamond formation, plan to really push into the defender's setup zone, if you take the one closest to you on the other flank, then it means the defender's probably going to have to swing around to go after it, or it gives them something extra to think about, basically, because if all they focus on is defending their own objectives, they're going to lose because you've got 4 if you took the 2 on your back line and 2 in the middle. And so actually, as the defender, you might want to think about charging forward back at the attacker.
That's a really good point. We've played this one before, and I guess when you first look at it and you think, oh, it's attacker defender, you think as a defender, you're going to be sitting back and then letting the attacker come towards you and then responding and dealing with it. If you do that, and if the attacker gets sufficient momentum, it's very difficult to win as a defender. I do think you have to push forward and have the means to push forward and either counter-attack if you lose an objective, or actually go after one of those deeper lying objectives that are closest to the attacker's start point later on in the game, when the attackers moved away from that and they focus their forces elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's one of the big risks as the attacker, because one of the other things you could do is just totally ignore that centre objective and just play it as a C, where you take the 3 down one flank and then have the opposite flank one closest to the attacker side. So you've got a nice C shape, and you could just leave like your artillery on that objective, sort of just put it in ambush, watching the objective, ready to take out any of the defenders units that come chasing it. But of course, that's a risky strategy. And so you'll probably want to commit quite a bit to defending your home objectives. But then you don't want to commit so much you haven't got enough to attack with. And so it's a great one for sort of thinking, because you could just play the classic sort of timely objective style mission, couldn't you, where you just aim for the middle 3. But that's the reason I quite like this mission, is that we don't have to play timely objectives down the centre line. We don't have to play sort of top secret where we're chasing just the one in the middle, or demolition where I have to go to your side of the board. There's sort of 2 or 3 valid strategies that will work for capturing these objectives.
I think what I like about this mission as well is that, so generally speaking, with bolt action missions, you get one of three. You get the ones that involve killing more units than your opponent. You get ones that involve taking and holding an objective, and you get ones that involve moving. Now, this one requires you to take an objective and to move, and potentially to have to hold that objective as well. So you've got a couple of the core kind of styles of missions appearing in this particular mission.
Yeah, I like a dynamic game. I find that when we do sort of gunline games where it's just you bring your big guns, I bring my big guns, our infantry don't want to walk in front of the big guns, so we sort of deploy tactically to counter each other's advances. And we just have a long-range battle. I don't find that as enjoyable as when we have battles where we have to sort of maneuver our troops around and think about where's the best position for this squad and where do they want to be sort of 2 turns down the line and how do I get them there without them getting massacred en route, basically. And so, yeah, 100% agree with that. The other thing as well is because we've got so many objectives, we've got 7 objectives, it's a really nice one if you're trying to differentiate players at a sort of a 3-game tournament and you want to do minor and major victories, because we're in key positions. If it's 3 objectives, usually it'll be one sort of 2-1. Whereas in this, because we've got 7 objectives, the victory conditions for this one more objective than your opponent, so that's 4-3, is a minor victory. 2 or more, so let's say I beat you 6-1, that would be a major victory.
Yeah. That whole use of minor and major victories, I think, is definitely worth TOs thinking about, because like you say, if you've got certainly a 3-game event over one day, it's often quite difficult to differentiate between players unless you're going to include things like secondaries and, kill points or dice preserved, or you're going to include minor and major victories as well as, say, secondaries or dice preserved. Just having that very simple mechanic of it's one lost draw and then maybe one other differentiating factor, i.e. a secondary or kill points, even that isn't often enough to actually differentiate the pack.
No, 100%. And the fewer games you have, I think the more of these differentiating factors you need to include.
Yeah.
And so if it's a very serious 3-game, 1-day tournament, I think you want to have minors and majors. You want to have secondaries as your secondary victory condition.
Yeah. Secondaries are your secondary differentiator.
Indeed. And then you want to have, I like dice difference as my tertiary.
Yeah.
So not dice killed, not dice lost, the difference between the two. And then finally, if all else fails, you can then go to your strength of schedule, can't you? Where it's sort of who faced the toughest opponents based on how. So let's say my opponents all finished 1, 2, 3, and your opponents finished 17, 18, 19.
Yeah.
Well, I faced tougher opponents, so if we ended up on the same points overall and the same dice difference, etc., then because my games were harder, that should put me slightly above you on the table.
Yeah.
And I think that's, so if we have those 4, it's going to be very difficult to end up with players all on the exact same. I don't think you can really with the strength of schedule, can you?
No, I don't think you can.
Possibly, because we could have played the same opponents, I suppose.
The statisticians out there could probably tell us. To be honest, you're not really going to have to sit down as a TO and work this out at the end of the day and go through 4 different differentiating factors. But the point is there.
No, exactly. I think what you find is that you may get the tie on the secondaries. Dice taken, generally you're not going to get a tie. You'll have people with the same dice difference, but the chances of them also having the same number of points and the same number of secondaries is very slim. And so it's very rare that you'd have to go to that 4th criteria. But it's nice to have it there just as a very, very backup plan. If you've got 2 players who've won 3 games with the same dice difference, same secondaries, you can do strength of schedule.
Yeah. What I like about the minor and major victory is that it rewards that person who keeps going and absolutely pushes not just to get the win, but gets a solid win. Equally, it recognises where we all have those games where we might lose the game and our opponent has literally limped across the line, but they've done just enough to deny us the draw or our own victory. And it may well be that in doing so, they've almost exhausted themselves. And if we were to play that turn 7, or let's say that it doesn't actually get to turn 6 and we're at an event and our turns have dragged on, we can see that were we to keep playing for another 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it's going to swing in our favour. And that can be quite frustrating when you lose. It's a categorical win or loss, and you lose in that situation. Whereas actually by putting in the minor victories and the minor losses and major victories and major losses, it does recognise where the game has gone. It does encourage that person to really push on to get that major victory, but without expending themselves to the point where they may actually not win overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And You're absolutely right. The amount of times you play a game and it's looking like a solid draw because your opponent has one unit with 6 pins. The only unit that can take an objective to win the game for them has like 6 pins on it. And they just happen to roll that snake eyes for the order test and manage to get them onto the objective with the very last order dice of turn 6. And then, as you say, there's no turn 7. And on the score sheet, that looks no different than if they'd tabled you.
Yeah.
Whereas the minor gives a reflection that actually this was a bit of a tighter game than someone who did table someone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like that point. I think that was a really good point.
Thanks. Fantastic. So if you head over to tabletoptommies.com and check out the latest blog, you'll be able to read about the mission in a bit more detail and also download a PDF of the mission briefing. We'd love to hear how you get on trying it out. Give us some feedback. So we've used it at events that we've run in the past. We've also used it casually at the club and at home as well. But it'd be great to get some more feedback from you guys once you've tried it out.
Please do send us your thoughts, send us some pictures of you trying the mission out. Let us know what you think of it, any suggestions to make it more fun or more balanced. As ever, thank you for listening. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.